This is the Virata podcast. In this episode, we speak with Alan Wherry. Alô Brasil! Jai Shri Matas! Welcome to our Virata podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Uncle Alan Wherry. How are you?
Wonderful.
It's funny because it's the third time I ask you how are you today, right?
It's okay. I don't mind being asked. As long as I'm still breathing in and out, I'm happy to answer.
So I think would like to start the this episode by asking you how was actually your childhood in Ireland? Were you a seeker when you were a child?
No. In fact, I was quite hostile to religion. I grew up in Belfast, and it was like a war zone between Catholics and Protestants. So I never met a Catholic except in a hostile manner. So, for example, if we went to the swimming baths, you paid your money, you went inside, and if you saw lots of young boys with these leather straps on their wrist, which were St. Christopher's, you didn't go in. You just go home.
So you were completely averse to all that sort of
And
religious
the other
warfare.
thing is that education was an apartheid. You see, the Catholic Church insisted that Catholics went to Catholic schools. And so the state schools were effectively just for Protestants.
And you went to, I mean, your family was Protestant, right?
Yes, but my mother and father just went to church for births, marriages, and deaths. What they used to call hatched, matched, and dispatched.
Excellent,
You
excellent.
see? And when I got to about maybe, I don't know, 12 or 13, my father told me that I would have to go and be confirmed, which I didn't want to do. And so he said he'd beat me up if I didn't go. And he never went to church. I'm sure my dad was a communist. But I said, well, why don't you go if it's such a great idea? He said, your mother wants you to go. And I said, well, then she should go. She's never been confirmed. So I had to get up. The weather in Belfast is terrible, by the way. So I used to have to get up on Sunday mornings. He would drag me out of bed, and I'd walk through the drizzle to this church where I would have to go through all this stuff about what I was supposed to believe as a Protestant. And it just didn't make any sense. So when I would ask questions, for example, I'd say, so what's the difference between us and Catholics? And the answer would come back, well, they believe in the divinity of Mary, which is
Ah,
not always true, by the way.
that's right.
Uh, it's not always true. And they also believe in transubstantiation. What's that? Well, they believe that in the Mass, that the bread becomes the physical body of Jesus
That's
and the
correct.
wine becomes his blood. So that means they're cannibals. You see?
That's a good point.
So so I had to go through this rigmarole of confirmation where the bishop puts his hand on your head. I didn't feel a thing, nothing. And a couple of months later, when my dad came in to drag me out of bed to send me to work, I just said, look, go away, old man. And he just went away and never bothered me again. But I did tell him, I said, look, I will never go to church again. If you've done this deliberately to put me off religion, you've been very successful. So I never went to church for many, many years.
Wow. So and after that, you never like search for anything else, or you just didn't want to know anything about religion anymore.
Well, when I was about 14, I bought a book on Zen. It was like a week's pocket money, so that would tell you I must have been interested to a level. But I tried to read the book and didn't understand anything in it. Nothing. So I gave up. So I was for many, many years I was an atheist. My first wife was a Catholic, and she was at convent school when I first met her. So I used to help her write her essays, which of course would be a complete attack on everything Catholics believe. And so our kids were never brought up in any religion. But her mother, who lived in Liverpool, uh, once christened our children when we weren't there in the kitchen sink with water, you see, ace,
Yeah,
queen,
yeah.
king, jack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when I found out it was such an absurd thing, I wasn't even annoyed about it.
I thought that only the priests would be, allowed to do such thing. I didn't know that anyone can use the
Well,
water in the Catholic Church. I mean,
you have the advantage of me since I didn't know anything about it and had no interest. So I went through my life. I got a job. I went to live in England, and I first few jobs I had, I was a disastrous failure at. And eventually I
what
did
was your
something
first
that I
job?
was, well, okay. When I was about 12, I worked delivering milk. So this man would come to my house, and I would get in this clapped out old truck, and we would deliver milk around Belfast. But that was part time, of course. My first job when I left school, I was a trainee telephone engineer.
Wow, when you had like still those fixed numbers, not the phones at home, not mobile
That's
phones.
Yeah, so every 3 months I was doing something different. So I started off going into the Mourne Mountains, and we would put up telegraph poles on the way to a farm. And it's granite, so digging holes in granite to put in a
Wow,
telegraph pole was hard.
I can imagine. I can imagine.
And I nearly caused the first strike in their history.
Really? So
Yes.
you wanted like raising the salary of all the
No, no,
workers?
no, no, no. No, so look, I would be in this big truck with these 6 men, and I wasn't remotely interested in anything that they were doing. So I used to, there was a big book in the truck which were called engineering instructions. So this told you everything that you could possibly want to know. How to put your hat on in the rain, how to put your raincoat on, how to climb a telegraph pole. If you're putting a new telegraph pole in, where do you put the things that you stand on? How far apart should they be? All this stuff. And then one day, I read something that was intriguing. It said, if you go to night school 3 nights a week, you're allowed a day off in order to study. Now, here's the thing. I was already getting Fridays off to go to technical college, except I never went. I just used to go and play snooker with my friends. And I never went, I only went to night school once. And this engineer said, in the post office, we use long cables for long routes and short cables for short routes. And I thought, I could have figured that out, so I never went back. But having read this, I applied for my day off in lieu of the 3 nights that I wasn't going to night school, which meant I was only working 3 days a week. So I had a day off in lieu. I had a day off to go to technical college and never went. But then I made a terrible mistake. I told one of my friends, and all of a sudden, all of the first year apprentices applied for a day off as well as me and got it. And then the second year apprentices applied for 52 extra days off or 52 days overtime. And there was nearly a strike. And I was called to the telephone manager's office in Belfast. And as soon as I went through the door, he started swearing at me and calling me a fifth columnist. Do you know what a fifth columnist is?
No, no.
No, I didn't know either. I had to look it up in the dictionary afterwards. But it's a sort of communist agitator.
Oh my
And he
God.
started naming all my father's friends who worked there. And he was swearing and swearing. And he sort of assured me that if I worked there till my dying day, he would see to it that I would never be promoted. So that was my first job.
And how much of the spirit of, changing the system you would have later on your in your life, and even like to question, like I think there is so much, I think, in what you write, and about like questioning the system, right? And I think maybe there is this spirit of a revolutionary, let's say.
Well, the Irish are pretty much rebels, they'll always like to find something to rebel about. And yeah, it was true when in my publishing career, for example, I always challenged orthodoxy. Why do we do it this way? Is there a better way of doing it? So I always enjoyed that aspect.
I think I mean in many ways also it's a way of questioning also our
Of
own kind of
course.
human existence. I
Yes.
think.
Well, it must be true to a certain extent of you. I mean, and the way you do your art is a questioning as well.
I think like I mean many artists, perhaps all artists, they are also people who question things. Why are things
Hmm.
like this way, and why we should behave like that?
Hmm.
Because after all, we are on a stage of fools
I've heard that somewhere
playing our
before.
part.
Hmm?
It's an amazing song. So, I mean, if you are listening to this and you don't know Uncle Alan, it's also a composer and a great composer. And I think most of your songs, they also question this human existence, why we should be in a stage of fools, right?
Well, I think that's originally said by Shakespeare.
Yeah, I don't know because I read Shakespeare in Portuguese, so I wouldn't know the terms in English.
Okay.
But so later you went to England and you went to the publishing industry at some point, right?
Well, I became a civil servant first
Okay.
in the tax department. I was an executive officer in Her Majesty's Special Commissioners
Oh
of
my
Income
God.
Tax. They hired about 40 18-year-olds that year, And I was by far the worst. We had 6 months of full-time lecturing and training. And at the end, they had these oral exams, and I was the worst. And I hated it. And can you imagine my parents? My father was a carpenter in the shipyard. My mother had worked in a factory before she got married. And they were so proud of me to achieve this executive officer status, you see, where you could never be fired and you would get a pension at the end. And so can you imagine how bad I felt that I was so useless at it, had no interest in it, and it was just ghastly. So I was there for about 2 years. And then I applied for a PO box number job advertised in the Daily Telegraph. And it turned out to be with Procter and Gamble, the manufacturer of soaps and detergents. So I got a job there.
And your parents, were they sad that you
Oh,
know
they were
like you left?
horrified. You know, to them, a salesman is a guy who sticks his foot in the door and tries to sell you an encyclopedia, you see. So they were appalled. And it was funny because when I eventually became a sales manager, and when I got married, I invited all my salesmen and their wives to my flat for a little party. And my father went up to a man who was about his age, and he said to him, "Do you mean to say you have to do what our Alan tells you to?" And the guy said, "Yeah, that's sort of how it works." You see?
So he was proud of you. I mean, probably in many ways after that.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't really get on very well with my parents.
You think it's because of the religious issues?
No, no, that had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
I was just difficult. My favorite aunt said about me, he was one of us, but different. And later on, some of my aunts and uncles, they had told my mum and dad, look, you're not treating him right. He's not going to take this. And in fact, as soon as he gets old enough, he'll walk through the door and that's it. You won't really see him again. Well, that's what happened. I went to live in England and my mother was appalled. And she once said to me, why can't you marry a nice wee Protestant girl from East Belfast like everybody else does? I think I said I'd rather stick needles in my eyes. But I didn't really mean that because plenty of perfectly nice wee
Of
Protestant
course.
girls from East Belfast. I just said it to annoy her.
And for sure, it
And
wasn't your destiny, right? Yeah.
it was not, no.
And then you went to England, and
Well, I was in
yeah.
England. I became a sales manager and I got fed up with that. And I went to see a psychiatrist, and he said to me, look, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. He said, the questions that you're asking yourself, your dissatisfaction is perfectly good. He said, the people that I feel sorry for are people who think the way you do and do nothing about it because in 20 or 30 years, they're going to be my clients. So he told me, he said, if I were you, I would give up your job and just look around, go out and meet people. He said, you'll find something. And I took his advice, gave up my job. I sold my executive house with a big mortgage and bought a really nice Edwardian terrace house. And so I did that, and after a while, I got headhunted for a job in book publishing. And I wasn't really that interested in that. But I wasn't interested in any job. But when the guy said it's with a publishing company, I thought, oh, okay, I'll do that.
So it wasn't really your initiative, but someone actually found you
Yes.
and offered
Yeah,
the job. Okay,
right.
amazing.
But it's interesting how people handle jobs and job interviews like that. You see, this is something I figured out for myself. So, this is a book publishing company. They're in Ealing in West London, and I'm living in Maidstone in Kent. So, how am I going to impress these people? So, to cut a long story short, I found out what were their best selling books. And from traveling from Maidstone to Ealing, I stopped in about 10 bookshops. And I drew up a little chart. So, W.H. Smith, Tunbridge, and I had their best-selling titles down the side, and if it wasn't there, I'd put an X. So you see, they're bound to ask you a question if you're going for a job as a sales manager, Mr. Wherry. If we hire you, what would you do to increase our sales? Now, most people give really boring answers. They'll make the salesman work harder and all that stuff, you see? But what I would do is I would say, okay, I understand that Catch 22 is one of your best-selling books. How many how many do you sell every year? And I don't know. If they said 100,000, I'm just making these numbers up just to make it easy to answer your question. I'd say, well, look, this book is only available in half the shops that I called on between leaving home and coming here. So you'll never probably get it into 100%. But for example, if you could get it into 70%, that would be an extra 30,000 copies a year that you would sell. So I just went through all these things, and you could see these guys were amazed because nobody's going to give them an answer like that.
So you got the job straight away.
Yes. And so that's how I got into publishing. It was a fantastic job, by the way. The money I was earning about four times what I was earning in Procter and Gamble.
Wow.
I had a fantastic car, free, and they took me on these amazing trips. So it was a great job.
Amazing. And when did you decide actually to open your own publishing company?
When Srimataji told me to leave the company I was working for and start my own business,
So you got your self-realization while you're working at this publishing house, right?
well, that was one publishing house. Then I got headhunted by Penguin. Penguin was the biggest paperback publisher in the world at the time. And then I was there for about 7 years. And then I went to a company which was a startup called Bloomsbury. I mean, they're the people who discovered Harry Potter, and they published Nobel Prize winning authors and things like this. And they had an office in Soho Square next to Paul McCartney's office. And one day, as I was going out for a cup of coffee, I saw on a wall a picture of Srimataji. Colin Heinsohn put it there. Now, in Soho, all of those posters that you see for rock bands and what have you, that's all controlled by a gang.
Oh, really? It's still to this day, or at that time, only that
Well,
time?
look, I haven't been there for 20 years, so I don't know about today, but it was at the time. So they were going to beat Colin Heinsohn up for sticking this poster up. You see? But that's what I saw. And I just thought, it's probably one of those Indian cults. They want your money or they want you to do something that your free will wouldn't let you do. But as every time I went out of my office, I looked at the picture, something about Srimataji's face, and I went to the meeting. It was on Friday night at Hammersmith Town Hall,
Which year was it?
1990.
1990. Okay.
So when I went to the meeting, I sat at the back to make a fast escape. And I didn't much like the yogis. They looked smug and arrogant to me. You see? This very good at mental projections. And they had on these badges, you see. If you went to McDonald's in those days, there was a big plastic badge with Ronald McDonald on it.
Oh, yeah.
So they had a similar plastic badge with Srimataji on it that said, "Behold the Mother." Well, what does that mean? You
So
know,
you reacted immediately.
I didn't like any of that. So I sort of sat there, and then, do you know Ken Williams, the actor?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah. So he gave an introductory talk, and I liked it. But I knew that I liked it because he was massaging my ego. He was saying things that I agreed with, you see? But it was a good talk. And then Srimataji came on, and that to me was just amazing. She talked a bit, she had a question and answer session, and I was really, the people were asking the most stupid questions. But she answered them kindly as in the way that she always did. And then she gave self-realization, and I was in bliss. So as I drove home that night, I remember thinking, you know, this is better than cocaine. But I also thought, this is going to change your life. But I had no idea the extent to which it would change my life. I was in such a state of bliss. I was definitely going to come back. But would you believe that I had been depressed from the age of about 14 to 47? I was 47 that night, at that time, and I was never depressed again. I I had done everything to stop smoking cigarettes, and nothing worked. And I never smoked a cigarette again after that night. I was never depressed after that night. And I used to have a heavy pot smoking habit. I never smoked pot again. Well, and the next thing is, all of a sudden, instead of being largely unaware of the world around me, I started looking at little children and pussycats and dogs and trees and leaves and rivers and just really enjoying them. So I changed very quickly. But about, I don't know, 3 months later, David Sparrow, who was the leader at the time, said, "There's about 1,000 new people like you came to that meeting. Do you know how many are still coming?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Guess." I said, 200? Just you.
Wow.
But one of the things that I quite liked about Sahaja Yoga was the sort of rather chaotic aspect to its organization. So as I was leaving Hammersmith Town Hall, they gave me a leaflet. This is where they have meetings during the week. And it said on Tuesday night, they had a meeting in Barnes. which is quite, I lived in Richmond at the time. And so on the Tuesday night, I went along to the meeting. But the hall where was shut, there was no sign of life. And so I went to the pub next door and said, "Is there a Sahaj meeting next door?" And they said, "Oh, it hasn't been there for a couple of years." So here they are, still handing out leaflets to new people like me. And it hasn't been there for a couple of years.
Wow. And at and then I mean, when you felt like this recognition for Shimataji, there was a specific moment that you had this realization.
I think it was both a specific moment and a process. So, for example, a year after I got my realization, and I went to meetings every week. In fact, I would often go to 2 or 3 meetings. I would go to Hampstead meeting. I would go to the meeting in West London, which was mostly Indians, and there was one in Richmond, which is where I live. So I would go to 3 meetings, and I enjoyed them all, but I didn't know anything about Sahaja Yoga. I mean, I meditated twice a day. I was very diligent in that, but I didn't really know anything about Sahaja Yoga. I'd see occasionally pictures of Indian deities, and all the men had makeup on, and I couldn't tell one from the other. They all looked the same to me. And then, after about nearly a year, the man who actually came to the Barnes meeting that didn't exist the same night as me, he told me he'd just been to Cabela. And I said, "What's that?" And he told me, he said, "I've been to a puja." I said, "A what?" I never heard that word. And so I said, "Well, what was it like?" He said it was life changing. Really? In what way? And then he said to me at one point, "You do know who she is, don't you?" And I said, "Well, I mean, she's a guru, isn't she?" "No, no, she's God." Now, I was an atheist at this point, you see. I'd been an atheist ever since this catastrophe of having being forced to go to church in Belfast. What? I mean, that's the last thing I want. I really don't want that. But I went to the next puja, which was Diwali in 1991. And that was fun. I mean, that was wonderful. But for a start, I didn't like, I thought, if I were just driving through this village and I saw all these men dressed in Indian clothes and all these women wearing Indian saris, this would look like a cult to me. See? But it didn't really bother me that much. I was enjoying being in this big blue pendle, big old circus tent they had in those days. So I was enjoying all that. And so I then went to the puja on the Sunday, and that was phenomenal. And I had to get up early to get the plane back to London because I had a meeting. And at about 3 o'clock on the Sunday morning, I heard this voice in the street outside. I was in one of those places in the town square. "Alan Wherry, Alan Wherry." So I looked outside, and it was this guy called Ian Paradine. And
Ah,
he said,
yeah.
"Srimataji wants to see you." "What?" "Srimataji wants to see you." So I got dressed, and we walked up the hill, and we were shown into Srimataji's room. And there was maybe a dozen people there as well as Srimataji. And, I just sort of sat and listened. I remember thinking, you know, at this point I'd recognized her. I realized her divinity at some point during the weekend. And I thought, You know, if I ever get a chance to speak to her, I will never speak to her as these people are speaking to her. It seemed to be, to my mind, a lack of respect and even a lack of recognition as to who she is. So there was all these conversations. And then she turned to me and said, I hear you could publish a book about Sahaja Yoga. I said, yeah. She said, how would you do that? And so I told her this great plan of mine. And she said, okay, go and do it. So the next day I got up early, we flew back to England, and Paul Winter and his wife gave me a lift from the airport into Soho where I worked. And you know, I liked working in Soho. As I walked through the streets of Soho, it was like I'd entered the gates of hell. The vibrations were terrible. And, by the way, when I tried to implement my great plan, it just fell apart.
What was your great plan?
Which was it? Well, you see, look, I knew I could do this because I'd done it when I worked at Penguin. I would get one of our editors to get his realization so he would know what he was talking about when he put the book together. And I would get our rights director who would sell serial rights to a newspaper, commonly in those days for £200,000, £400,000. And so I went along, I told the editor, he was happy to go along with this. I took him to this yogi's house one night. Yogi gave him realization. I didn't feel confident about that. And a couple of days later, I said to him, how's the meditation coming along? He said, I tried it with a picture of John Lennon. It didn't work. Well,
Why?
this is an English public school educated fellow making fun of you, right? So I then took the rights director to the Sparrows house in Hampstead, and they gave her realization. Now, the opposite happened to her. She was a very nice woman. She had a degree in Russian from Oxford, but she was living with a man and it was misery, and she couldn't get out of it. So within a couple of days of her meditating, her prison doors opened and she was free to leave. And she never meditated again because she said, this is too powerful.
Wow. She was afraid, perhaps.
She was. But the point I'm making is I knew Sri Mataji had done this to bust my ego, which was quite interesting to think about it because she could have let me go ahead and get the book published. She could have just let it work, but she didn't. Why was that? Well, it seemed to me at the time, and I don't know whether this is true or not, it seemed to me at the time that she would prefer to bust my ego for me than to have a best-selling book.
Wow. So, and that time, the Advent was published already, or not?
Well, not this is I have a big problem with what Sahaja Yogis regard as published. What does that mean? Look, the Advent was only, to use your term, published in India. It was never published in the West. In fact, it wasn't even available here. A few yogis in England had copies, but it wasn't commonly available.
Okay, so the original publication, I mean, publication, let's call it, was in India. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So, I was, of course, I there were a number of occasions in my life where things like that happened that made me realize that she's Mahamaya. I think there's a lot of yogis who appear to recognize her divinity as Adishakti, but I think Mahamaya is more problematical. But I was lucky because there were so many instances where the fact that she was Mahamaya was undeniable to me.
And and you realized this straight away, or there was some process of why the book is not working out, or
Well, I knew that my plan had fallen apart, and I couldn't make it work because the ingredients that I needed. You see, if, for example, the Daily Mail had serialized this proposed book, they would have advertised it on TV. It would have been a huge seller because I'd seen it happen before.
and then Shimataji, after that, she told you to leave this publishing house, right?
Well, that was a long time later. Let's see. So I was working for Bloomsbury, and uh, at first it looked to be very difficult to make this publishing company work. It was probably about 4 years in that we started to get signs that this was going to work. And all of a sudden, we were the new kids on the block. Everybody thought we were amazing, wonderful, hip, and cool. We were none of those things, by the way, but who was I to tell them to tell them this? You see? So what happened then? Um, well, what happened was that my wife at the time said to me, "If you don't give up this Sahaja Yoga, we're finished." And I thought, what? What's your problem? I'm not smoking and drinking. I'm not doing the things that I used to do. What's your problem? But anyway, she insisted. I said, okay, listen, if that. Oh, she did say to me too, she was convinced I was in a cult. She said, why don't you just stop doing it for 6 months? And I said to her, well, look, I could easily tell you that I'd stop doing it and carry on doing it, but I'm not going to. I've got too much respect for you. But if you insist on this, then okay, we're done. And so after 20 odd years of marriage, we split up, and she did her best to turn my children against me with some success, I got to tell you. And then Ray Harris did my astrology chart, and he said, I've never seen a chart like yours. He said, there was no question that you were going to get your realization in this lifetime.
Wow.
But he said, interesting, there's no earth element in your chart. I still don't know what that means. It can't be that good. So anyway, he said, I don't think you'll get married again. So I saw Srimataji and I said, Srimataji, do you think I should get married again? Absolutely, she said. She said, I'll find a nice wife for you. I'll find you a Russian wife. They're very pretty. You'd like that. There was no arguing with that. So, of course, like, what's going to happen next? And every time I went to Russia, because Sahaja Yoga was just starting there, and lots of English people went, and it was extraordinary. I was thinking maybe this is the time. But um, nothing much happened except in St. Petersburg at this big medical conference where Srimataji is one of the main speakers. Um, I got a message at the lunchtime Yogi Mahajan wants to see Alan Wherry. And so I was never particularly keen to go and chat to Yogi Mahajan because, he's written all these books and he wasn't really interested in hearing constructive comments about his books. So I wasn't particularly, like, well, what else am I going to tell him? So anyway, I went to see him and he said, Srimataji wants to see you. And I was ushered into her room in the hotel and she was having lunch. And here's the thing. I knew whatever happens, I'm never going to say no to Srimataji. Never. So she said, how would you like Yogi Mahajan to choose a wife for you? And I thought, oh no. I think I was rather hoping you would choose a wife for me, Srimataji. So I just said, as you wish, mother. She said, Yogi, go and choose a wife for him. So he went out and he came back with this marriage form and gave it to Srimataji. And she looked at it. And I was looking at her, not an eyelash quivered. Her face was like stone. And she handed me the piece of paper and said, what do you think? So I looked. So, you see, I thought, well, I didn't feel anything, neither warm nor cool. She didn't speak English. She lived in Novosibirsk, capital of Siberia. And I just said, oh, your choice, mother. She said, where are you going tomorrow? I said, well, I'm coming to Kiev with you. No, don't do that. She said, go to Moscow. We'll get this woman to come to Moscow. And she said, take her to the British Embassy and tell them you want to marry her. So I'm thinking, okay, so let's get this right. I go to the British Embassy with this woman and I say, look, I just met this woman. She doesn't speak any English. How do I go about marrying her?
Wow. Because, yeah, I mean, at that time it was quite difficult to do that, I suppose. Now you had to prove now that you were actually in a relationship with a person.
More than slightly. More than slightly. So anyway, I went to Moscow. Everybody else went off to Kiev. And I was very lucky because I was staying in the apartment of this guy called Sergei Novikov. And Novikov, he and I couldn't really speak to each other, but we always made each other laugh. We were good company together. And he's the sort of guy, if he's a fixer, if you said to him, look, I want a hall for 10,000 people and I want a 40-foot truck, he would say, okay, it'll cost you, what, £40,000. You give him and half an hour later, you've got a hall booked for 10,000 people, and there's the truck.
Oh my God, he was well connected.
Well, you see, I don't know. He was in the Russian street gangs before he came to Sahaja Yoga.
Oh, I see.
So anyway, the plane was arriving at 6 a.m. So at 3 a.m., he and I got up out of bed and we did a little puja to the Adi Shakti. And then we caught a bus and then a tram, then a subway train, and then another bus to this airport, which seemed to be a long, long way outside Moscow. And when we had a picture of the woman, there's a door, a normal-sized door. We're standing beside the door. And when all the passengers got off, she wasn't on it. So he went and made an announcement over the intercom, nothing. So we went all the way back again. He said, well, let's go tomorrow. So Sunday morning, 3 o'clock, we got up, did a little puja to Srimataji, did all this stuff, went all the way. She wasn't there. And so about 11 o'clock, the phone rang, and it was this woman. She had arrived on Saturday. Now, explain that to
Ah,
me. We had her photo, we had Sahaj badges. She came out this door. We were about 6 feet away from the door. She didn't see us, we didn't see her.
oh my
How's that
God.
possible?
No idea.
So she can't see me now because she's broken the heel off her shoe. And I'm thinking, if what's coming between me and my wife is a broken heel, I'll buy her a pair of shoes. But that wasn't on offer. I never spoke to her. And so she said she would phone back on Monday. You see? The thing was, I had to fly back on Tuesday for my work. So Monday morning comes, 11 o'clock, phone rings. It must be her, except it isn't. It's the leader of Moscow to say that in Samara airport, Sri Mataji had decided that I would marry somebody else. And somebody else was arriving at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and I should go and meet her. Do
Oh
you see
my
the
God.
Mahamaya in all of this? Do you? Yeah?
Oh yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You see? And so the Novosibirsk woman was sent back to Novosibirsk. I had to go and meet this other woman. I met her in the subway station beside Red Square. And can you imagine, like, you're 52 years of age, and here's a woman, here's two Sahaja Yoginis. Which one is going to be your wife? And she said, she looked at me, and the first thought in her mind was, this is my husband. That was her first thought. And it took me slightly longer than that, probably all of 5 minutes. So when we walked out in Red Square, and she didn't speak much English, about 200 words of university English, and we had a yogi guy who was there to translate for us, and we bumped into Victoria. So here's another thing, and because I want to get across this Maya thing. So when I got back to England, um, I had been. I went to the Russian embassy and they gave me this long, long list of things that I needed. I needed this form, that form, this form, that form. They had to be translated, and not by any Tom, Dick, or Harry, by their translators. They had to be sealed, government seals, and so it took me like nearly 3 months to put all this stuff together. So I had a pile of paper about this big, you see. And so I went back to marry her in January. And and I did. So I married Ludmila in this palace of culture. It's like town hall. And there were two old ladies wearing carpet slippers conducting the ceremony. And it was very nice, really, really nice. And but when I showed them all these papers, they said, "We don't want to see this stuff. We don't care about that." And they just all this work that I had done for months, they just didn't care. So after a couple of days, we went back to Moscow. So now I got a problem. How do I get her into England? Okay, that's a problem. Lots of yogis have had problems like this. So we went to the British Embassy and it was freezing cold. This was January. It was like minus 20 or I don't know, cold. And there was a line outside at least a mile long. I had on, I used to have these really flashy suits. I had this cashmere overcoat. You could see this was not cheap. and my nice suit. And I just walked with Ludmila right to the front of the line and walked straight in. There were two guards on the outside. They didn't challenge me. I just walked straight in with her. So when we got in, after 5 minutes or so, it was our turn. So we went up to see this woman. And I said, "This is my wife. I want a family residence permit for the UK for her and her family." And the woman said, "What? You can't have that." I said, "Well, that's what I want." I said, "Look, I'm not asking you for it. I require it." She said, "You have to come back here at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and we'll put you in one room and your wife in one room, and we'll ask you both questions." Now, I knew from other yogis that this had happened, and in the case of one very good friend of mine, it took him about 4 years to get his wife into England
Oh my God.
because they contradicted each other. I mean, if you marry somebody
Mm.
like and 4 days later, what's her favorite color? You're going to be in
Yeah.
trouble, aren't you?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
You
of
see?
course.
So anyway, she said, "No, no, you got to come back." And I said, "Look, I've been to an immigration lawyer in London, and I'm a citizen of the Irish Republic. And I want you to go and speak to your boss and tell him there's a citizen of the Irish Republic outside, and he requires a European family residence permit for his wife and family." And so she
Mm.
went out and came back about 2 minutes later with a big long face. And she's, but so she had to give it, but they made it hard. They made Ludmila go back to her town, Zhigolovsk, and back again, 34 hours on a train to get a piece of paper that wasn't necessary. And they said, this will have to be referred back to England. Within a couple of weeks, we had this. She could come and live in England.
Wow. But so there were no questions like not from both of you, no. So you, as you were like an
Yeah,
Irish
but
citizen, so you
well,
didn't
hold on.
require that.
Look, I'm from Belfast. Belfast is
Yeah.
an integral part of the United Kingdom. I'm British, okay? So if they'd insisted on this interrogation,
Uh,
but I happen to have, I've got an Irish passport as well, because
mm.
the Irish Republic have always insisted that they have jurisdiction over the North.
Oh, I see.
So when I was working for Penguin and traveling around, it was better to have an Irish passport than an English passport, because if the plane got hijacked and you were English or American, you're in trouble. But if you're Irish, you're one of them. You see, up the rebels. So I'd had this Irish passport for years. But if this woman had understood my accent was Belfast, she could have caused trouble. So how's that?
So you managed actually, you handled the situation perfectly, I think. Yeah.
Well, or somebody else did, you know?
And after so much Maya, no, so you had some moment of, I think, easy path, I would say.
Well, you know, you'd say I started writing poems and songs but that was only after I was married to Ludmila. I
Wow.
could never write anything before that, nothing.
Wow.
So all that muse, if you like, all that inspiration came from her.
Yeah.
And I've never met anybody like her. She's the most astonishing woman I've ever met. You know, Sahaj marriages, when they work well, are extraordinary. I hope you know that for yourself.
Yes, of course. My marriage, for example, it's amazing, and I think we should give more value to Sahaja marriage in Sahaj. So coming back to your story, you were completely surrendered, completely drenched in this power of love, I would say.
Well, what else are you going to do? Because as soon as you let your ego in on this, you're in trouble.
Yeah. Wow. This is one of the most difficult part, like the surrender aspect.
So later on, um, see, the thing is, I'd always wanted to start a publishing company in America. But the CEO of Bloomsbury, who's American, said it couldn't work. And everybody said it couldn't work. Not possible. But I kept on at him. And eventually he said I could do it. Now, the thing is, look, I know I could not do brain surgery. I know that I couldn't land a jumbo jet at Heathrow Airport or JFK. Start a publishing company? Why not? There's no magic. You see? So I tried to research and did, in fact, why did all British publishers like Bloomsbury fail in America? I couldn't get the answer until I met this man called Bob Gottlieb. And he told me why they'd all failed. He said, you know, the thing is, you people think we like you. We don't. He said, you think we admire and respect you. We don't. He said, if we ever bother to think about you, which isn't very often, you've got a queen and you've got a palace and you've got these guys with funny hats walking up and down outside. He said, but that's only if we think about you. We don't. You see? He said, the mistake you make is you come over here and you start an outpost of your British company and you fail because we don't care. He said, if you want to be successful, you have to look like you've got to be an American publishing house on day one. So that's what I did. And so that was about a year later, Srimataji told me to leave Bloomsbury. Sometimes Srimataji says things to you which, on the face of it, don't make sense. She said to me, the CEO of Bloomsbury is afraid of you because you're an Ulster Protestant. Now, my first wife was Catholic, so he was Catholic. He couldn't possibly think that I was anti-Catholic. There's no way he could think that. So why is Srimataji saying this? He's afraid of you because you're an Ulster Protestant. And she told me to leave Bloomsbury and she said, I will help you start a publishing company. I'll tell you what to publish.
And this was Daisy America.
Yeah. So that's how that happened. So, you know what I think is funny? I have a very good Sahaj friend, English, by the way. And he was talking to me last week and he said, why did you leave Bloomsbury? I mean, you'd started it up in America, it was working really well, you had bestsellers. Did you ever hear of a book called Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain?
No,
He
no.
was a famous celebrity chef. He committed suicide a couple of years ago. Well, we published that book out of the blue, and it was a huge bestseller. But so this friend of mine said, how could you leave? I mean, you were doing so well. Your people had tremendous respect for what you'd achieved. Why did you leave? I said, because Srimataji told me to. If Srimataji told me to stick my head in the fire, I'd stick my head in the fire. But I'd be hoping that as it got close to the coals, she'd say, okay, I'm only joking.
That's it. Yeah. There is one story that I've heard. about Bloomsbury. So you were one of the founders of the publishing house.
Yes.
So there was one story that I've heard that one lady came with the story of a wizard with a long beard, and then you said, "Hey, why did J.K. Rowling? Why you don't tell the story of an orphan that goes to a school of wizards?" Is that true?
No. See, it's amazing the stories that get told in Sahaja Yoga. I'll tell you a funny one. When I first came to Sahaja Yoga, as I told you, I was not initially impressed by the yogis in Hammersmith Town Hall. And when I became a yogi, so like after 3 months and I'm meditating regularly, I realized how gullible most of them were. And I thought, what is the least likely thing that anybody would believe about me? So I told one yogi that I'd been a major in the SAS, you see?
Oh, wait.
And within a couple of weeks, loads of people were saying to me, "Were you really a major in the SAS?" I said, "Look at me. I'm a complete rebel. I would hate to be in anybody's army. Look at me." You see? And so that went on for some time. And these stories about Harry Potter, look, I mean, I had nothing to do with Harry Potter. It would be a bit like if you worked for the Ford Motor Company and I said, "You must have invented the Ford Mustang, mustn't you?" And you say, "No, I just work in the Croydon sales office." "No, no, 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 you definitely invented the Ford Mustang." I had nothing to do with it.
I've heard some stories that you gave the idea to J.K. Rowling.
Oh,
No, just kidding. Wow, amazing. Yeah, so many stories that are created in Sahaja. Perhaps this was one of the first fake news, I think.
there's always been fake news. One of the worst gossip columns in English journalism was the Londoner's Diary in the Evening Standard. And they once did a story which said, last year, according to Bloomsbury's annual accounts, Nigel Newton, who's the CEO, earned £300,000 and Alan Wherry earned 500,000. Well, that's complete nonsense. I don't know where that came from, and it's a million miles away from the truth. But again, the yogis believed that, you see, because it was in the paper.
Wow, yeah. Somehow the Maya spreads fast, I would say.
Well, I guess you see, because we are in general so unsuccessful at spreading Sahaja Yoga, anything that looks like the possibility of success, we want to hold on to that because it's what we're looking for. I understand that.
Yeah, we want kind of for sure now that Sahajog became as popular as possible. No,
Yes.
like yeah, something that everyone wants to be part of.
And if you think about it, America has a population of 320 million. There's about 1,500 yogis. I don't know the exact number, but it's about there. About 1,200 are Indians. This is an Indian collective.
Well, yeah.
We're not doing very well. We're not doing very well. And there's a talk Srimataji said in Connecticut in 1989, how disappointed she is with the lack of success here. It's not much better. 30 years later. I have never understood this. When I came to Sahaja Yoga, I thought within 2 or 3 years, this is going to take over the world. Have you ever heard of a man in British advertising called John Hegarty?
John Haggerty.
His company was
No.
called Bartle, Bogle, and Hegarty. And he is a superstar in the world of advertising. The first superstar was an American guy. He came up with the idea of unique selling proposition. Yeah, USP. My son's white shirt is whiter than your son's white shirt because I use Persil. My product's better than yours. John Hegarty realized that actually now all these products were the same. So soap powders were equally good, one as another. Levi's were just as good as Wranglers. There was no great cars, BMWs, some other car. They're broadly speaking the same. So he figured out how to advertise and became very famous. Now, I knew him for a while, and he told me in the late 1990s that by the year 2000, everybody would have an altar in their house. I wanted to believe that because I had an altar in my house. Why not everybody else? So, what's interesting is I'm sure, like you, I've met so many really famous people. I've traveled the world. I have never met people like Sahaj Yogis. They're the most phenomenal people I've ever met.
Indeed. There's always something that's very interesting, always talking to you, Alan, is this desire also to spread Sahaja Yoga on a large scale, but at the same time to find different ways, creative ways, like to bring people to Sahaj.
But, I will also spread Sahaj Yoga on the smallest possible scale. You know, I like giving realization in the street or in a coffee shop. It, it, I'm not looking for millions. I'll work with one. And I've often tried, you know, I make it a game. How in how few questions can I get can I ask before I give this person Sahaj realization? So, for example, you meet a guy, he's a golfer. Say, you enjoy playing golf? Yes. What's your handicap? 6, he says. I don't know anything about golf. Say, oh, that's quite good, isn't it? Yeah, he said it is quite good. Tell me, what's the biggest problem you have playing golf? Well, sometimes when I'm about to make a putt near the hole, I get very nervous. Oh, would you like me to show you something that would help you calm your nerves before you make that shot? Then I give him realization.
Very spontaneous and always trying to find also what's the soft spot of the person.
Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, I'm always surprised. I live in an apartment. The neighbor across the corridor is a very nice guy. I said, would you like me to show you meditation? No. Oh, okay. So that's all right. And, I just started 2 weeks ago a new meeting in a library, which is about a quarter of a mile away. I think about 5 people came, and they're letting us have it for 3 weeks to see if we can make it work. But none of the people who came and got the realization, I don't think it meant anything to any of them. But we'll see.
Yeah, you never know, no, but if you see your case, no, perhaps people, the yogis wouldn't recognize like a potential yogi in you, perhaps.
I'm sure that's true. And it must have been the case for you. When I used to run Sahaj meetings, like we haven't so much because of the pandemic, but I used to look at people and think, is he going to make Sahaj Yoga? Is she going to make? I'm always wrong.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I know it's always difficult to try to to foresee what's that person like future. Yeah.
Yes. So, has it ever occurred to you, you're in England, what would happen if next week 500,000 people all over the UK suddenly wanted their self-realization and came to Sahaja Yoga meetings?
Yeah, probably wouldn't have like venues enough to accommodate all these people.
So, how is Sahaja Yoga likely to spread? It's unlikely to spread that way. Suddenly, 500,000 people turn up.
Yeah, would have to have some event, not like a major event that everyone comes on in a very short period of time.
Well, another possibility is that what you already do suddenly starts to work on a vast
Hmm.
scale. Now, there isn't much sign of that happening, but of course, we always think, why not? And I think the other likely possibility, Sri Mataji said that she reunified Germany through just a few yogis who lived there. So I think her working through us, bringing about a change in consciousness, is probably the most likely thing.
I totally agree. Yeah, but yeah, how it's going to happen, I think that's part of the fun of the script, not the divine script, how it's going to happen.
But you see, I get from my own experience of Srimataji saying, go ahead and publish a book, it's not likely to happen through me.
Well, we never know. I don't know if the other encounters with Shimataji, if Shimataji told you anything about what you should publish. I mean, she told you to open Daisy American at this publishing house, and you were already in the States, right? She asked you to go to the States.
Yes.
So can you tell a little bit the story?
I can't remember too much. It was in Ealing, her house in Ealing, and she called Ludmila and me into her room and said, I'd like you to go and live in America.
And what was your first reaction?
Srimataji tells me to put my head in the fire.
Yeah.
So she said, I think you should go and live in California. But there was a bit of toing and froing, and the message went back to her, look, they could go to live in New York because he started a publishing company there. He could get a green card. She said, okay, do that.
Okay.
But on the few occasions, I meet lots of people new to Sahaja Yoga, and they're always saying, oh, you guys are so lucky you knew Sri Mataji. And I say, you know, there were people who had a lot of ongoing contact with Sri Mataji. Not very many, but there were people who had that. I said, that was not where we were. There were people who had some contact with Sri Mataji on a few occasions. And that's us. That happened to us. But when we were there in the company of Sri Mataji, conversation, dialogue wasn't really on the agenda. We were there to sit and shut up and listen. And then I will say to the new people, and then there are people like you, maybe 90% of yogis will not have that one-on-one contact with Sri Mataji. I said, but none of that matters. There are lots of people who had much contact with Sri Mataji who couldn't hang on. They're not in Sahaja Yoga anymore. So what you think it would mean to you didn't mean that to them.
Yeah, because I think a lot of yogas imagine that as close as you are to Shri Mataji, perhaps as deeper you are as yogi and you stay longer in Sahaja, but it's not necessarily the case.
I heard people say, and I don't know whether it's true or not, is that Sri Mataji would give the most attention to the people who most needed it. So if you take a person who was around when Sri Mataji was around and she didn't give them much attention, maybe it's because they didn't need it.
Yeah, makes sense.
Well, see, I don't know that there's very much that makes sense in Sahaja Yoga because I still don't understand very much.
That's true. I feel a lot like like going to the ocean and trying to surf. You just go along with the waves. You don't create the waves, but you just go along and you don't question too much when it's coming and when it's going.
That's it.
And perhaps it would be nice if you could tell this story when you moved to the United States. There's I think, amazing miracle that if you'd like to share.
I don't know which miracle.
The miracle, I just don't want to give a spoiler, but when you went to the doctor.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. So, when you go to a new country, you have to go to the doctor. And so we went to the doctor and he gave us these forms, pages and pages. Have you had this? Have you had that? Have you been injected for this, for that? And then there was one thing it said, have you had a colonoscopy? What? What's that? And they told me what that was. I didn't. And they said, well, you have to have one. In America, we give them to people over 50, and I was 57. So it's they basically look into your colon because colon cancer is the fourth most common form of death in America. And in my case, they found a lump bigger than my little finger, which are always precancerous. So the specialist said if you'd have stayed in England, you would have died. So he removed it. Every 6 months, I had to go back and have another one. Every 6 months, they kept finding more. They call them polyps on the same spot where he removed the big one.
Wow. And it was like an operation that you had to do all the time, no?
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, they don't give you an anesthetic. They give you something that's more like a drug, but you don't feel anything. So anyway, after this happened a few times, this guy said to me, look, as before, we have to check, is this cancer? If it is, we've got problems. If it isn't, we're going to have to do major stomach surgery to remove this section of your colon. He said, come back in 2 weeks. So Sri Mataji was at her house in New Jersey, and the two doctors looking after her, friends of mine, Dr. Bogdan and Ramesh Manocha, and I told them, and they said, oh, you got to tell Sri Mataji. Now, she wasn't at all well. And I thought, I'm not going to go to Sri Mataji and say, oh, Sri Mataji, I know you're not very well, but I'm not very well. Please help me. See? So
Save me.
I'm not going to do that. So when I went to see her, I saw her on the Sunday, and that was very nice. She said some very nice things. But anyway, on the Monday, I went to see the specialist, and he said, I have no idea what I cut out from you, but it wasn't a polyps. You've got a clean bill of health. Come back in 10 years.
Amazing. So you felt like you were reborn.
I don't really think like that. It's obviously I'm glad. It's I'm glad, but I don't sort of think the way you've just described.
But you didn't feel like, oh my God.
No, no, no. I just accept it. Yeah.
So you were completely surrendered.
I wouldn't say completely, but I hope I will be ever more surrendered. But yeah,
And I don't know if there is any other story that you'd like to share.
I can't think of any. But I think, lots of people have amazing stories.
It just reinforces really this power, of the of Shimataji and the attention that she has in all of us, and
Hmm.
the story also of the book about Sahaja, like this play of Mahamaya.
Hmm.
I think it's really inspiring. It's really inspiring. But I think until today you have the plan now to perhaps to publish this book about Sahaj, right?
I don't know. Um, you see, I've written about 80,000 words, which is about half a book, but I don't think it's very good. And I think it would be very difficult to get a good commercial publisher to take on a book about Sahaja Yoga because the way they think is quite absurd. So they would say, "Okay, you've got this book on Sahaja Yoga. Have I called it the net right name? Yes, that's the name. How many people in America do it? 1,500. Okay, well, we don't want to publish it because if the market's 1,500 people, we couldn't make any money publishing it." Well, publishers are essentially lazy. They don't want to do any work if you can get somebody to do the work for you. That's why I was telling you that in Bloomsbury, we would sell serial rights to a newspaper. They'd advertise it on TV. All of a sudden, you had 1 million people wanted to read your book, but you didn't do the work. Somebody else did.
It was different times, right? How you advertisement a book, and now I think it's really about how many followers you have now on social media, how many people practice now
Hmm.
Sahaja Yoga. So I think it's a challenge in that sense. But I'm sure that there is one way, kind of, to find like a way to touch people's heart.
I'm certain there is. I just don't know what it is. So I'm looking to people like you to find out.
Yeah, I don't know if I can be of much help, but it's definitely something that I'm really interested because, yeah, it's all to do with attention and how we can touch the people's hearts.
See, one of the things that I was fascinated by when I came to Sahaja Yoga, growing up in Belfast, there were always guys standing on street corners with big red alcohol faces, you see? And they would be standing shouting and preaching. And they would say, "I used to be like this. I used to spend all my wages on the horses. I used to beat my wife and drink all. And now I found Jesus, and now I'm like this, you see?" And I wondered, why didn't Sri Mataji ask us to tell our stories? And she didn't. And, you know, I couldn't second guess what Sri Mataji thought or didn't think. I mean, I just not able to do that. But she certainly didn't ask us to give testimonies about what we experience. And that's quite interesting to me. You know, I remember her saying, I once asked her, "Srimataji, how can I improve my attention?" She said, "There's nothing wrong with your attention." Well, I knew there was. I heard a talk a long time later where she said, you know, when you ask me questions, sometimes I won't answer your questions because it's not going to help you. You have to find out for yourself. So maybe the fact that somebody was a drunken wife beater and now they're Sahaj isn't going to help somebody who is not a drunken wife beater to come to Sahaj. Is that possible?
Yes, it is. So thank you very much, Alan. It was a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Amazing stories.
I always enjoy chatting to you. Jai Shri
Thank
Radhaji.
you. Jai Shri Mataji. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find more interviews in our book, Virata Conversation with Sahaja Yogis Volume 1. You can purchase the book on Amazon and you can find the link in the description of this episode. Thank you.